And welcome back to another episode. In this video, I'm planning on going over part 4 of Scott Adams' book Win Bigly, which deals specifically with how to use persuasion in business and politics. I'm not going to go into detail and describe everything in this chapter, but I do want to go over a few highlights to just kind of to demonstrate some principles of persuasion that I think are very interesting. If you want more details on this, as well as the other topics that Scott covers in this section, I do suggest you read the book yourself, as it is extremely interesting and it explains how Donald Trump got elected, but also really how the human brain works and how you can use persuasion techniques in your own life potentially. Hence why it's not just Donald Trump winning bigly, but it could be you yourself. At any rate, we're going to go over how Trump uses visualization to get his points across and to persuade. We're going to go over how to pick a vice president and why Mike Pence was actually perfect from a persuasion perspective. And we're also going to go over a topic that I've actually gone over before, which is known as the high ground maneuver. But in this case, though, we're going to talk about Steve Jobs' use of it. And I will go over briefly some of the other highlights from this section. So as far as visualization goes, two tips that you really need to keep in mind are that visual persuasion is far more powerful than non-visual persuasion, all other things being equal. And the difference is large. We are visual beings. I suspect because of evolution, we put a real premium on what our eyes see over what we hear or what we think or what we even conceive. And persuasion tip number 19, also from Scott's book here, is in the context of persuasion, you don't need a physical picture if you make someone imagine the scene. And Donald Trump does this all the time. And one of the biggest examples is during the election campaign, whenever Donald Trump would talk about the wall, and that he was going to build a big, beautiful wall. And a lot of times people would criticize him for that, saying, well, it's not specific, it actually can't work. If you're going to build a wall, there's some parts where you can't build a wall, there's some parts where maybe electronic surveillance makes more sense, so on and so forth. But the key thing, though, is that by just keeping it simple and saying the wall, is that for the person listening to it, you can imagine your own wall, and that becomes very powerful. And you can even kind of read into what you think a wall should be. So if you want a wall with a big gate so people can come in, you can imagine that. If you want a wall that's very imposing, like the Great Wall of China, you can imagine that too. Nonetheless, when people were kind of attacking Donald Trump for not being specific about what a wall could be, they were really arguing from a perspective of border control, which is a concept, versus the wall, which is very visual. And a visual would beat a concept any day of the week. The next example of visual persuasion actually comes from an interview that Donald Trump did with CNN personality or reporter Chris Cuomo. And in it, Chris Cuomo kind of puts a question to him about, hypothetically, if you met the Pope, what would you say if the Pope said, capitalism is bad, it brings out the worst in people, etc., etc. And this is a very difficult question to handle for a non-persuader, because there's so many ways that you can answer incorrectly. So, for example, if you agree with the Pope that capitalism is bad, that kind of makes you look weird as you're Donald Trump. You're a businessman, you have all these buildings named after you. It doesn't really work. However, if you disagree with the Pope, then you're criticizing His Holiness, and that doesn't really work either. If you try and refuse to answer the question or just try and disengage, you'll wind up looking very weak. So Donald Trump, being the master persuader, what does he do? He just ignores all of this kind of thought and just gives you a strong visual, in which he says, what I would tell the Pope is that ISIS is coming to get him. And right away, that is such a strong visual image. It literally wipes out everything that Chris Cuomo was asking about as far as a concept goes. And you kind of see how Chris Cuomo responds. Like he's almost like he's not sure what hit him. And again, what it boils down to in this case is you have a concept, which is possibly corruption and capitalism, which are just concepts, versus the idea of ISIS overthrowing the Vatican, which is very visual and practically movie-like. So just watch this clip now, and I think you'll see what I mean.
So here's the moment. You meet the Pope. Pope Francis comes.
Right.
There's a translator there.
Right.
And he says, oh, Mr. Trump, this is very nice. And then he says, I want to tell him something. The translator says to you, the Pope believes that capitalism can be a real avenue to greed. It can be really toxic and corrupt. And he's shaking his finger at you when he says it. What do you say in response to the Pope?
I'd say ISIS wants to get you. You know that ISIS wants to go in and take over the Vatican. You have heard that. You know that's a dream of theirs to go into Italy.
He talks to you about capitalism? You scare the Pope?
No, I'm going to have to scare the Pope because it's the other thing. There's only one. Look, the Pope, I hope, can only be scared by God.
Is the ceiling open over here right now?
The Pope, I hope, can only be scared by God. But the truth is, if you look at what's going on, they better hope that capitalism works because it's the only thing we have right now. And
the next item that I found very interested in this section was the process Donald Trump used to pick a vice president. And on the surface, when he picked Mike Pence, from a two-dimensional perspective, which is kind of the perspective Scott talks about, which is the belief that people are logical and we make rational decisions. I mean, it was a good pick. Mike Pence had experience as both governor and a senator, for example. He was very conservative, so it kind of helped him kind of consolidate his conservative base. And he just seemed like a competent guy, which of course is what you want in your number two. However, the worst thing that you can have when you pick a number two is you don't want your number two to outshine you. You definitely don't want people saying, hey, why were you going with this guy when we should have gone with the other guy? But once again, we're looking at it from a 3D world, a world of persuasion in which people are irrational 90% of the time. But in this case, though, the Mike Pence pick is still a stellar pick because it comes down to the power of contrast, which is a persuasion principle. And the worst thing you can have is a situation where your number two outshines your number one in some way, so people kind of decide that, oh, maybe we really want number two. And Mike Pence actually excels at this. Although people take Mike Pence very seriously, he obviously has way less charisma than Trump. And the way Scott Adams describes it, it's almost like Pence is like a black and white picture compared to Trump's full color. He's almost like a washed out version of Donald Trump. I mean, when you're looking at them, I mean, he's not even as tall as Donald Trump is. It's very clear who number one is and who number two is when you're comparing Donald Trump to Mike Pence. And the same kind of dynamic occurred with Reagan to Bush and then Bush to Dan Quayle. When Reagan was running, he picked George Bush as his number two. Again, George Bush was seen as a career politician. He was seen as very competent, but he nowhere near had the star power or the persuasion skills that Ronald Reagan had, particularly with his previous role as an actor. Now, when Bush had to pick someone, so now he's got to pick someone who is less interesting than he is, and he naturally chose Dan Quayle. However, at this point, Dan Quayle was sort of that much more washed out, and he could never be taken seriously as actually being a president. So it's kind of like you're continually washing clothes until the color fades out, and you have nothing. And that's why I think it's kind of interesting. Clinton's pick of Tim Kaine as vice president, like who makes? I mean, Clinton, who already is not a good public speaker, really has very little charisma. Who can you pick that kind of makes her look good, or is less than she is? And I think she wound up picking Tim Kaine, who just wasn't that strong a candidate. But who could she have picked her that would have made her look good? I mean, I don't think there really was anybody. But again, I think this whole idea of not wanting your number 2 to outshine your number 1 is actually pretty interesting, and why the Mike Pence pick was actually a very persuasive pick. Now, the final major topic I want to cover in this video is one I've mentioned before on several occasions, which is called the high ground maneuver and how to use it. Now, the high ground maneuver is when you're kind of arguing something, and what you do, you take the argument out of the weeds, which is the details, and you elevate it to where no one can basically disagree with it. And Donald Trump does this on many occasions, but in this case, I want to use the late Steve Jobs as an example. Now, in this video I'm about to show you, there was a lot of controversy around the iPhone 4 and how its antenna was positioned, and it was apparently dropping calls. So Steve Jobs was forced to give a presentation where he dealt with this issue, and how he dealt with it is the high ground maneuver. So let's just watch a bit of this presentation, and then we'll talk about it.
Well, let me get started. You know, we're not perfect. We know that. You know that. And phones aren't perfect either. But we want to make all of our users happy.
Okay, so you see, this is a perfect example of the high ground maneuver. He starts off by saying, we're not perfect. Well, you can't agree with that. All of us know we're not perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. He then says phones are not perfect. And you can't disagree with that either. The iPhone 4 is not perfect, but neither is any other phone out there. I mean, they all have an issue of one kind or another. And then he says, we all know that, but we're going to make our users happy. And so from right there, he literally just diffused the whole controversy of the antenna, and with the high ground maneuver, he raised the argument to a level where no one could disagree. And it worked quite brilliantly, actually. But that is why Steve Jobs himself was a master persuader, and why you constantly hear people talk about Steve Jobs as having a reality distortion field, and that he can make people think things that seemingly other people couldn't. But again, that's what this book's about, and that's what Donald Trump does, and that's what Steve Jobs did as well. Now, when you read this book, there are some other... I just kind of want to go briefly over some of the highlights of some of the other topics that are in this section. So some of the things that Scott talks about are what are known as linguistic kill shots. Donald Trump did this a lot when he was talking about, labeling people like Lying Ted or Little Marco, for example. And he also talks about why Hillary Clinton's attempts at branding Trump were typically failures. He also talks about creating effective slogans and logos, how Donald Trump was very effective doing that, and why Hillary Clinton was not. He talks about Godzilla, who is sort of a legendary persuasion author, and when he got into the fight and how it kind of changed the whole race. He talks about creating 2 ways to win and no ways to lose, and I found that very interesting as well. And it's also kind of a grab bag of Trump's quickest and easiest tools of persuasion, which you will probably find useful as well. So once again, if any of this sounds interesting to you, if you think it's as interesting as I do recommend you pick up the book and read it in detail yourself. There is a link below which will definitely help support the channel, which I would appreciate. And if you have any questions or comments about Persuasion, about Win Bigly, about Donald Trump, I would like to hear about that. Other than that, don't forget to like and subscribe. And I just want to thank you for watching, and until next time.